She lifted the champagne glass with surgical precision, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. Elena Park thought she was correcting a social error, putting an outsider back in her place. She thought the pregnant black woman standing alone in Seoul's most exclusive ballroom was just another social climber who'd slipped past security. She had no idea that woman was carrying the heir to Korea's most dangerous empire. And she certainly didn't know that the media cameras streaming live to thousands of VIP viewers had already captured her face, her voice, and the crime she was about to commit. This is the story of how cruelty drowned in its own poison. The air inside the Grand Josian Ballroom, the crown jewel of Seoul's annual Met Gala, smelled of imported French roses, aged champagne, and generational wealth. For Chica Rowland, however, it mostly smelled of isolation. Chica stood near the eastern wall, one hand resting protectively on the soft curve of her belly, where 5 months of life grew in gentle rhythm with her heartbeat. Her ivory gown, custom designed by a Parisian atelier, flowed like liquid moonlight across marble floors that had hosted presidents and princes. She was breathtaking. She was also visibly, undeniably alone. It was 9:23 p.m. on a Saturday evening. The gala was reaching its social apex, that dangerous hour when champagne loosens tongues and old grudges find new oxygen. A symphony of crystal glasses chiming against imported china punctuated laughter that cost more per syllable than most Koreans earned in a month. The chandelier above her head, a cascading waterfall of Swarovski crystals imported from Austria, cast golden light across faces that belonged to Korea's untouchable class. CEOs whose decisions moved markets. Politicians whose words rewrote laws. Celebrities whose scandals were carefully managed by teams who understood that image was currency. And then there was Chica, the only black face in a room built for pale perfection. Move with confidence, her husband had told her. They'll respect strength. Chun Min-jae had squeezed her hand exactly 11 minutes ago, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm. Stay, enjoy, I'll be back before you know it. She'd trusted him. She always trusted him, even when the rest of the world underestimated what trusting Chun Min-jae actually meant. Chica tugged gently at the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, a wedding gift from her husband that cost more than most people's homes. The gesture was unconscious, a small tell that betrayed the discomfort she was trying so hard to hide. Eyes flickered toward her from every corner of the ballroom. Curious. Dismissive. Calculating. She felt each glance like a physical weight, the kind of assessment that strips you down to your skin color, your accent, your right to occupy space. To the patrons of this gala, Chica was a disruption in their carefully curated aesthetic. She was the hand that didn't match the glove, the note that didn't belong in the symphony, the face that reminded them the world was changing in ways they hadn't approved. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 10,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. They didn't notice the small scar on her left wrist from the car accident 3 years ago in Lagos. They certainly didn't know that 2 years ago, Chica had been a rising human rights attorney in Nigeria, one of 5 lawyers selected for the International Justice Fellowship at The Hague, until a chance encounter at a legal conference in Singapore changed the trajectory of her entire life. That's where she'd met him. Chun Min-jae. The man who walked into negotiation rooms and left with everything he wanted. The man whose name made politicians nervous and police captains rich. The man who'd looked at her across a hotel lobby and decided, with the same cold certainty he applied to business, that she would be his wife. Now she wore designer gowns and carried his child. She lived in a penthouse that overlooked the Han River and was protected by men who would kill without hesitation if ordered. She'd traded her law books for a life she was still learning to navigate. Elena Park moved through the crowd like a predator who'd just caught a scent. Bleach blonde hair swept into an elaborate updo. Borrowed diamonds that caught the light with every calculated movement. A smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Chica saw her approaching, but didn't understand the danger. Not yet. That's the thing about cruelty. It disguises itself as curiosity until it's too close to escape. Elena had been watching Chica for the past 20 minutes, her mind working through possibilities like a detective solving a crime. Who was this woman? How had she gotten in? And most importantly, how could Elena use her to entertain the circle of socialites who were growing bored with the evening's predictable elegance? To Elena, Chica was an anomaly. A black woman, visibly pregnant, standing alone in a room where everyone else traveled in protective packs of wealth and status. Clearly out of place. Obviously uncomfortable. Definitely vulnerable. The universe, Elena decided, had handed her a gift. And Elena Park had never been one to waste an opportunity. She crossed the marble floor with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. Champagne glass held like a weapon she didn't yet know she was carrying. Behind her, 3 of her friends followed, their phones already emerging from designer clutches. This would be worth recording. This would be the story they'd tell for weeks. What Elena didn't see were the cameras positioned throughout the ballroom. Professional media equipment operated by the Gala's official documentation team, streaming every moment to VIP viewers who'd paid premium prices for exclusive access. The cameras that had been tracking the evening's most beautiful attendees and had, for the past 5 minutes, been focused on the stunning pregnant woman in ivory who seemed so heartbreakingly alone. What Elena didn't know was that she was about to commit her crime in front of thousands of witnesses. And that some crimes, once recorded, can never be undone. Chica turned as Elena approached, offering the slight smile she perfected over 2 years of navigating her husband's world. Warm enough to seem genuine, distant enough to maintain boundaries. Because Chica Rowland's story didn't begin in this ballroom. It began in Lagos, Nigeria, in a small apartment where a brilliant girl grew up believing that justice could be won through law books and courtrooms. It began in The Hague, where she'd been selected for a fellowship that would have made her one of Africa's most influential human rights voices. And it took a sharp turn in Singapore in a hotel lobby, when a man with cold eyes and careful hands looked at her and decided she belonged to him. That's where we need to start. Because to understand why what happens next matters, you first need to understand who Chica Rowland was before she became the pregnant wife of Korea's most dangerous man. Elena Park had been born with a gift for finding weaknesses. It was the kind of talent that couldn't be taught in business schools or inherited through bloodlines. She could look at a person and see exactly where to press to make them break. Tonight, standing in her borrowed Valentino dress and rented diamonds, Elena was hunting for entertainment. The gala had been predictable so far, the same conversations recycled among the same faces. She needed something to make her relevant again, something to remind Seoul's elite that Elena Park was worth paying attention to. That's when she saw Chica. A pregnant black woman, standing alone, visibly uncomfortable. Elena's mind began calculating immediately. This woman didn't belong here. The way she stood, the way her hand kept touching her necklace, the way she seemed to be trying to disappear into the wall behind her. Everything about her screamed outsider. Perfect. Elena crossed the marble floor with practiced confidence, her 3 closest friends following instinctively. They recognized that look in her eyes, the one that meant someone was about to become a story they'd tell for weeks. "I don't believe we've met," Elena said, her voice dripping with false courtesy. She positioned herself directly in front of Chica, blocking her view of the rest of the ballroom. "I know absolutely everyone here, and I'm certain I would have remembered you." Chica looked at Elena with the kind of calm that comes from having survived worse. She'd faced hostile judges in Nigerian courtrooms. She'd negotiated with warlords who'd committed atrocities her law books couldn't even name. A wealthy woman with a sharp tongue was not the most dangerous thing she'd ever encountered. "I'm Chica Rowland," she said quietly, her accent carrying the musicality of Lagos mixed with the precision of legal training. Chun Min Jae's wife. The ballroom seemed to inhale. Several people nearby stopped their conversations, turning to watch. Elena's friends exchanged glances, their phones already emerging from clutches. But Elena's smile didn't falter. It sharpened. Because Elena Park had built her entire social position on the ability to read people, and everything about this woman screamed lie. A pregnant black woman claiming to be married to Chun Min Jae, the most powerful and feared man in Korea's underground empire? Please. Elena had seen social climbers before. She'd watched countless women try to attach themselves to powerful men, using their names like skeleton keys to unlock doors they had no business entering. This woman was just another one, probably someone's plus one who'd been abandoned and was now desperately name-dropping to avoid humiliation. Really, Elena said, her voice loud enough to ensure everyone nearby could hear. She wanted witnesses. And I suppose that makes you what? Korean royalty? Should we all bow? Nervous laughter rippled through the growing circle of onlookers. Phones were definitely recording now, but Elena assumed they were capturing her moment of social justice, her righteous exposure of a fraud. She had no idea those phones were documenting her destruction. Chica's expression didn't change. She'd learned, over 2 years of being Chun Min Jae's wife, that silence was often the most powerful response. Let people reveal themselves. Let them build their own traps. I understand this might be surprising, Chica said, her voice still quiet, still dignified. But yes, I'm his wife. We've been married for 2 years. This is our first child. Her hand moved protectively to her belly, a gesture so natural, so maternal, that it should have triggered compassion in anyone watching. But Elena saw only opportunity. A pregnant woman was even better. More vulnerable. More pathetic. The humiliation would be exquisite. What Elena didn't know was that across the ballroom, the head coordinator had frozen mid-conversation. He just turned to look at the commotion and recognized Chica immediately. His face had gone pale because he knew exactly who she was, and he knew with absolute certainty that what was about to happen would have consequences that would shake this building to its foundations. He started moving toward them, but he was too far away, and Elena Park was already raising her champagne glass. The question wasn't whether she would pour it. The question was whether anyone would be able to stop what came after. Time has a strange way of bending during moments that will be replayed 1,000 times. Later, when people watched the footage, when journalists analyzed every frame, when lawyers presented it as evidence, they would all remark on how the moment seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Elena lifted her champagne glass with the kind of theatrical flourish that revealed she'd been planning this. The golden liquid caught the chandelier light, sparkling like liquid stars. You know what I think? Elena's voice had risen now, performing for the crowd that had gathered. I think you're a liar. I think you walked in here with someone, got left behind, and decided to play pretend with names you heard whispered in corners. She tilted the glass. The champagne began to arc through the air. Chica saw it coming but didn't move. Couldn't move. Because moving would mean protecting herself, and protecting herself would mean disturbing the baby she'd spent 5 months learning to love. Her hand remained on her belly, shielding what mattered most. The champagne hit her gown like a golden wave. It splashed across the ivory silk that had taken a Parisian designer 3 weeks to create, soaking through the fabric, staining it the color of old gold and fresh humiliation. The ballroom gasped. That sound, that collective intake of breath, would be described differently by everyone who heard it. Some called it shock. Others called it horror. A few, in their most honest moments, would admit it sounded like excitement. Chica stood frozen, champagne dripping from her dress onto marble floors that had hosted royalty. Her expression didn't crumble into tears or rage. Instead, something else flickered across her face. Something that people who knew her husband would have recognized immediately. Pity. She felt pity for Elena Park, because Chica knew something about consequences that this woman clearly didn't. She knew that some actions cannot be undone. That some moments, once they occur, reshape reality itself. Elena wasn't finished. She'd committed to this performance, and she would see it through. Does this look like a place where people of your class attend? Elena's voice echoed across the ballroom, the words chosen with surgical precision. Not your income level. Not your social circle. Your class. The racism wasn't subtle. It wasn't coded. It was deliberate and clear, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never been held accountable for cruelty. The cameras caught everything. The media team's professional equipment, positioned throughout the ballroom, had zoomed in the moment the confrontation began. They captured Elena's face, twisted with theatrical disgust. They captured Chica's dignity, heartbreaking in its quiet strength. They captured the champagne stains spreading across ivory silk like blood in water. And they captured something else. Something in the background that Elena, in her moment of triumph, failed to notice. The head coordinator had finally pushed through the crowd. His face wasn't just pale anymore. It was gray, the color of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. He reached for Elena's arm, but she shook him off, riding the high of what she believed was social dominance. Behind him, a security guard was speaking urgently into his radio. And near the ballroom's main entrance, a door was opening. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happens when Chun Min-jae finds out his pregnant wife was just humiliated in front of Korea's elite is something you absolutely cannot miss. Chica spoke then, her voice so quiet that people in the back of the crowd had to strain to hear. "I'm fine," she said to the coordinator who'd finally reached her. "I'm simply waiting for my husband." There was something in those words. Something that made the smartest people in the room start backing away. Because anyone who truly understood power in Seoul knew that Chun Min-jae's wife didn't need to defend herself. She just needed to wait. The ballroom had fallen into a strange hush. Conversations continued in whispers, but the music seemed distant now, as if the string quartet had sensed the shift in atmosphere and adjusted their volume accordingly. Chica stood in her ruined gown, champagne still dripping onto the marble, and felt the familiar numbness that came with being reduced to a spectacle. She'd experienced this before, in different forms, in different countries. The particular flavor of cruelty that came from people who believed their wealth or status gave them permission to diminish others. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone in a Lagos courtroom facing judges who saw her gender before her arguments. She wasn't standing in The Hague being patronized by European lawyers who couldn't believe someone from Africa could match their expertise. This time, she was the wife of Chun Min-jae. And that meant something very specific in Seoul. Elena was still performing, playing to her audience with the kind of energy that suggested she was feeding off their attention. "Someone should really check the guest list," she announced to no one in particular. "I mean, security must be getting lazy if just anyone can walk in off the street claiming to be married to Mrs. Chun." The voice cut through Elena's monologue like a blade through silk. The head coordinator, a man named Kim Sang-woo who'd been managing Seoul's elite events for 20 years, had positioned himself between Elena and Chica. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a weight that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. "Mrs. Chun, I apologize profusely for this incident. We have a private room prepared. Please, allow me to escort you there immediately." The use of the name, the formal title, spoken with such deference, should have been Elena's first warning. But she was too high on her own performance to notice. "Mrs. Chun." Elena laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Oh, is that what we're calling obvious frauds now? How much did she pay you to play along with this charade?" Kim Sang-woo didn't respond to Elena. He simply extended his arm to Chica, his eyes communicating something that made her nod slightly. She accepted his arm with the grace of someone who'd learned to navigate impossible situations with dignity intact. As they began to move toward the private rooms, Elena made her final mistake. She grabbed Chica's arm. It wasn't a hard grab, just enough to stop her movement. Just enough to assert dominance one more time. Just enough to ensure that when people watched the footage later, they would see not just verbal assault, but physical contact. Uninvited. Aggressive. Against a pregnant woman. "We're not finished," Elena said, her voice dropping to something more dangerous. "You don't get to walk away from this. You don't get to. Remove your hand." The voice came from behind them. It was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it carried the kind of authority that makes spines straighten and hearts accelerate. The crowd parted like a sea before a ship. Chun Min-jae had entered the ballroom. He wasn't running. He wasn't shouting. He was simply walking with a kind of purposeful calm that people who understood violence recognized immediately. He was a man of average height but exceptional presence, wearing a black suit tailored so precisely it looked like darkness given shape. His face was expressionless. Not angry. Not concerned. Empty in a way that was somehow more terrifying than rage. Elena's hand dropped from Chica's arm as if burned. She turned to face him, and for the first time that evening, her confidence flickered. Because when you look into the eyes of someone who's ordered deaths without hesitation, your body knows before your brain does. Chun Min-jae didn't acknowledge Elena's existence. He walked directly to his wife, his eyes scanning her face, her ruined gown, the champagne stains that told their own story. When he saw her hand protecting her belly, something shifted in his expression. Not rage. Something colder. He removed his jacket, wrapping it around Chica's shoulders with movements so gentle they contradicted everything his reputation suggested. He kissed her forehead, his lips moving against her skin as he whispered something only she could hear. Later, Chica would tell investigators that what he whispered was, "Are you hurt? Is the baby safe?" And when she nodded, when she assured him they were both fine, he'd whispered one more thing. "Then go with Sang-woo. I'll handle this." The words "I'll handle this," spoken by Chun Min-jae, meant something very specific to people who operated in Seoul's real power structures. They meant that someone's world was about to end, and it would happen so quietly that most people wouldn't even notice until it was over. Chica left with Kim Sang-woo, disappearing into the private rooms where staff immediately began attending to her. And Chun Min-jae turned, finally, to look at Elena Park. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply looked at her with eyes that had seen men beg for mercy they would never receive. And Elena Park, for the first time in her carefully constructed life, understood what it felt like to be afraid. But the fear was just beginning. Because outside the ballroom, across Seoul, throughout South Korea and eventually around the world, the footage was already spreading. The moment Elena poured champagne on a pregnant woman was being clipped, shared, and viewed by millions. The internet was about to deliver its verdict. And unlike the legal system, the internet never forgets. By the time Chica was settled in the private room with medical staff checking her blood pressure and the baby's heartbeat, the video had already been viewed 3 million times. The Met Gala's official media team had been streaming the event live to VIP viewers who'd paid premium prices for exclusive access. When the confrontation began, viewership had spiked. When the champagne was poured, someone in the control room made a decision that would change everything. They clipped the incident. 23 seconds of footage. Elena's face twisted with contempt. The champagne arcing through golden light. Chica's quiet dignity. The racist words echoing across marble floors. And they posted it to the Gala's official social media with a caption that was clinical in its neutrality. Incident at tonight's Gala under investigation. The internet doesn't need context to render judgment. It just needs a villain and a victim. Within 15 minutes, The clip had been shared 50,000 times. Within 30 minutes, it was trending on every platform. Within an hour, international news outlets were picking it up, their headlines growing more inflammatory with each iteration. Pregnant woman humiliated at Seoul's elite gala. Racist attack caught on camera at exclusive event. The champagne incident, when privilege turns violent. But what made this different from the thousands of other viral moments that briefly capture attention before fading was the comment section. People weren't just expressing outrage. They were organizing. Someone with excellent research skills had identified Elena Park within the first hour. Her social media accounts, her business connections, her carefully curated image as a Seoul socialite. Everything was screenshot and archived before she even knew to make her profiles private. By the second hour, the real digging had begun. And what they found was worse than anyone expected. A Reddit user posted a scanned newspaper article from 10 years ago. A teenage girl in Busan had taken her own life, leaving behind a note that detailed months of bullying. The primary bully named in that note was Elena Park, though she'd gone by a different name then. Elena Choi. The article had been buried, settled out of court with the family receiving money in exchange for silence. But silence, once broken by the internet, cannot be re-established. More emerged. A woman in Singapore posted about an online romance scam from 5 years ago. She'd lost her life savings, $200,000, to someone she'd met on a dating app. Someone who'd used the name Elena Song. The photos matched. The pattern matched. Financial investigators, both professional and amateur, began following money trails. Elena Park's wealth, they discovered, wasn't inherited or earned through legitimate business. It was assembled through a patchwork of frauds, scams, and carefully managed deceptions. She'd changed her name 3 times. She'd moved through different social circles, always positioning herself as someone who belonged, someone whose wealth was old and unquestioned. She'd learned to mimic the patterns of generational wealth so convincingly that even Seoul's elite had accepted her. But the internet is patient. The internet remembers. And the internet had decided that Elena Park's carefully constructed identity would be dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the truth. By the third hour, major sponsors were releasing statements. A cosmetics company that had Elena as a brand ambassador terminated their contract. A charity organization removed her from their board. Her membership to 3 exclusive clubs was quietly revoked. The public punishment was swift and merciless. But it was nothing compared to what was happening in the shadows. If you're finding this story fascinating and want to see how power really operates when cameras stop recording, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because the next chapter reveals what happens when a man like Chun Min-jae decides someone has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. In the private room at the gala, Chica sat in a chair too expensive to have a price tag, wearing her husband's jacket over her ruined gown. The doctor had confirmed what she already knew. She was fine. The baby was fine. Physically, at least, nothing had been damaged. But Chica was a lawyer. She understood that physical harm was only one type of violation. What Elena had done was an assault on dignity, on humanity, on the belief that some spaces were supposed to be safe. Your blood pressure is slightly elevated, the doctor said, his voice gentle. But that's to be expected given the circumstances. I recommend rest, hydration, and avoiding stress. Chica almost laughed at that last part. Avoiding stress. As if that were possible now. The door opened. Chun Min-jae entered alone, having left whatever he'd said or done to Elena in the ballroom behind him. When he looked at Chica, his expression softened in a way that only she ever witnessed. He knelt beside her chair, his hands covering hers. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I promised you would be safe. I failed. Chica shook her head. You didn't fail. That woman made a choice. Her choice, her consequences. But she saw something in his eyes that made her pause. Because Chun Min Jae's version of consequences wasn't legal or public. It was something else entirely. "What are you going to do?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. He stood, kissed her forehead again, and said simply, "What I always do. Protect what's mine." And then he was gone, leaving Chica alone with the doctor and the growing understanding that Elena Park's viral destruction was only the beginning. The real reckoning would happen where cameras couldn't reach. By morning, Elena Park's life had become a crime scene that investigators were excavating in real time. Seoul's Financial Crimes Unit received an anonymous tip at 6 a.m. A detailed dossier, professionally compiled, outlining 10 years of fraudulent activity. Wire transfers. False identities. Victims across 3 countries. The evidence was so meticulously organized that prosecutors later admitted they'd never seen anything so thoroughly documented. The tip was anonymous, but everyone who mattered knew where it came from. Men like Chun Min Jae didn't make public statements. They simply ensured that the right information reached the right people at the right time. By 8 a.m., Elena's bank accounts were frozen. Not just her primary accounts, but offshore holdings she believed were untraceable. Someone had mapped her entire financial network and delivered a gift wrap to authorities who were suddenly very interested in how a woman with no documented legitimate income had acquired millions in assets. By 10 a.m., victims were coming forward. The woman from Singapore who'd lost her savings. A businessman from Tokyo who'd invested in a fake tech startup Elena had pitched. A widow from Busan who'd been convinced to hand over her late husband's life insurance payout. The stories shared a pattern. Elena identified vulnerable people, people experiencing transition or grief or loneliness, and she exploited those vulnerabilities with surgical precision. She didn't just steal money. She studied her targets, learned what they needed to hear, and delivered exactly that until their defenses crumbled. It was, prosecutors would later note, the work of someone who understood human psychology at a deeply disturbing level. Someone who saw other people not as individuals worthy of empathy, but as resources to be harvested. The suicide from 10 years ago gained new attention. The girl's name was Park Ji-woo, and she'd been 14 when Elena, then 16, had decided she would be the perfect target. The bullying had been systematic. Photographs stolen and shared. Rumors spread with calculation. Social isolation enforced through careful manipulation of peer groups. Ji-woo's parents had accepted a settlement because they'd been told that's what people did. That dragging a wealthy family through court would only bring more pain. They'd taken the money and tried to bury their grief alongside their daughter. Now, a decade later, they were being interviewed on every major news network. And they were saying something that changed the narrative completely. "We never wanted money," Ji-woo's mother said, her voice steady despite tears. "We wanted accountability. We wanted Elena to understand that our daughter's life mattered." But her family made that disappear. They made everything disappear. Until now. The story had transformed. This wasn't just about a racist incident at a gala. This was about a pattern of cruelty that had been allowed to continue for a decade because wealth and connections had shielded the perpetrator from consequences. Elena's social media accounts, before she could delete them, had been archived by thousands of people. Every photo, every caption, every comment was being analyzed. People found pictures of her at charity events she'd used for social climbing. Videos of her giving speeches about women's empowerment while privately destroying other women's lives. The hypocrisy was staggering. And the internet, which had been outraged by the champagne incident, was now absolutely furious about the depth of Elena's deception. Companies that had worked with her were issuing apologies. Organizations she'd been affiliated with were opening internal investigations. Friends who defended her in the first hours were deleting their supportive posts and claiming they'd never really known her. The social exile was complete. In Seoul's elite circles, where reputation was currency and access was everything, Elena Park had become untouchable. Not in the way powerful people are untouchable, protected by their status. Untouchable in the way that plague carriers were untouchable. Anyone associated with her was contaminated by proximity. Her apartment building's management received complaints from other residents. Security footage showed her trying to enter and being turned away. Her lease, they informed her, was being terminated for violation of community standards. She had 72 hours to remove her belongings. Her gym membership was revoked. Her favorite restaurants suddenly had no reservations available. The hair salon where she'd been a VIP client for 3 years called to cancel all future appointments. Seoul's elite were erasing her with the efficiency of people who understood that survival sometimes meant sacrificing one of your own to protect the herd. But all of this, the viral outrage and the financial investigations and the social exile, was still just the surface. The visible consequences. The part that happened in daylight where cameras could record and journalists could report. What was happening in the shadows was something else entirely. Elena was staying in a hotel now, one of the mid-tier options that still accepted her rapidly declining credit cards. She sat in a room that cost more per night than most people earned in a week, but felt cheaper than anything she'd experienced in years. Her phone had become a weapon turned against her. Every notification was another attack. Another sponsor dropping her. Another friend blocking her. Another journalist requesting comment on allegations she couldn't even begin to address. She'd tried calling her lawyer, the expensive one who'd handled delicate matters for her before. He'd been polite but firm. "I'm afraid I can't represent you in this matter." Conflict of interest. He didn't specify what the conflict was, but Elena understood. Someone had gotten to him. Someone had made it clear that representing Elena Park would be bad for business. She tried 2 more lawyers. Both declined with the same vague reasoning. That's when Elena began to understand that what was happening to her wasn't just viral outrage or legal consequences. It was orchestration. Someone was systematically dismantling her life, and they were doing it with resources and reach that suggested this wasn't about justice. This was about sending a message. Her hands were shaking as she poured herself a drink from the minibar, alcohol she couldn't really afford but desperately needed. She thought about that moment in the ballroom, about the pregnant woman standing there so quietly, so pathetically vulnerable. How was she supposed to know? How was anyone supposed to know that the woman was actually who she claimed to be? It had seemed so obvious that she was lying, so clear that she didn't belong. But even as Elena tried to justify her actions to herself, she knew the truth. She'd known within 30 seconds of talking to Chica that the woman might actually be telling the truth. The jewelry was too expensive to be fake. The gown was too perfectly tailored to be borrowed. The quiet confidence, even in discomfort, spoke to someone accustomed to wealth. Elena had known. She'd just decided that humiliating her anyway would be more entertaining than admitting she'd been wrong. And now she was learning what that decision cost. Her phone buzzed. Another notification. But this one was different. A text from an unknown number. 7 words that made her blood run cold. "We need to talk about your future." No signature. No context. Just those 7 words and a time. Midnight. An address in Gangnam she didn't recognize. Elena stared at the message, her mind racing through possibilities. This could be a journalist. A lawyer. A victim seeking confrontation. Or it could be someone sent by Chun Min-jae. Someone who operated in the spaces between legal and lethal. She had 3 hours to decide whether to show up. 3 hours to weigh her fear against her need to understand what came next. And in those 3 hours, Elena Park would finally begin to grasp the full scope of her mistake. The address led to a restaurant in Gangnam that Elena didn't recognize, which was unusual because she'd made it her business to know every establishment that mattered in Seoul's wealthiest district. This place was unmarked, accessible only through an alley between two luxury buildings. The kind of location that didn't advertise because its clientele found it through whispers and personal invitations. Elena stood outside at 11:55 p.m., her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to go back to her hotel room and disappear. But disappearing to where? Her life in Seoul was already over. Her accounts were frozen. Her reputation was destroyed. Whatever waited inside this restaurant couldn't be worse than what she was already facing. She was wrong about that. The door opened before she could knock. A man in a black suit, early 30s, expressionless, gestured for her to enter. The interior was dimly lit, expensive in a way that didn't need to prove itself. Bamboo screens divided the space into private sections. The air smelled of aged whiskey and the kind of cigars that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The man led her to a private room in the back. Seated at a low table, backlit by soft golden light, was someone Elena recognized from photographs but had never met in person. Chun Min-jae. He didn't stand when she entered. Didn't acknowledge her arrival beyond a slight gesture to the cushion across from him. Sit. Elena sat, her legs feeling unstable. This close, she could see why people feared him. It wasn't his size or obvious menace. It was the absolute control he radiated, the sense that everything within his sphere of influence moved according to his will. Do you know why you're here? His voice was quiet, conversational, more terrifying than shouting would have been. Elena's throat was dry. To punish me. No. He poured tea with movements precise as surgery. You're already punished. The world has handled that. Your accounts are frozen. Your reputation is destroyed. The prosecutors building cases against you will ensure you spend the next decade explaining your actions to judges. That's punishment. He slid the tea across to her. Elena didn't touch it. You're here, Chun continued, because I wanted to understand something. I wanted to look at the person who poured champagne on my pregnant wife and screamed racist slurs in her face, and I wanted to understand what kind of human does that and feels entitled to walk away. Elena's hands were shaking. I didn't know she was your wife. I thought she was lying. You thought a pregnant black woman was lying about being married to me. His tone didn't change, but the words landed like physical blows. And your response to that suspicion was to humiliate her publicly, to assault her, to make sure she understood that in your world, she would never belong. I made a mistake. Yes. Chun Min-jae leaned back slightly. You did. And now you're going to help me understand why that mistake happened, so we can ensure it never happens again. Elena's confusion must have shown on her face because he continued. You see, Elena, I don't care about you. Your suffering means nothing to me. Your regret is worthless. But what happened to my wife can't happen to anyone else. So you're going to tell me everything. Every thought that went through your mind when you saw her. Every assumption you made. Every moment of that decision. And if I don't? His smile didn't reach his eyes. Then the evidence package that prosecutors currently have, the one that documents 10 years of fraud and predatory behavior, will be supplemented. New victims will come forward. Crimes that are currently outside the statute of limitations will be reinvestigated with resources that make statute of limitations irrelevant. Instead of 10 years in prison, you'll spend the rest of your life there. Elena felt tears burning her eyes. You've already destroyed me. What more do you want? I want, Chun said carefully, for you to understand that actions have consequences. That cruelty, especially cruelty targeting someone because of their race or vulnerability, will be met with responses that are systematic and absolute. I want you to become an example. Not through my violence, but through the legal system working exactly as it should when motivated by proper resources. He stood then, the meeting clearly over. You have a choice, Elena. Cooperate with the investigation fully. Provide testimony about every crime you've committed. Help prosecutors build cases that will bring justice to your victims. Do that, and you might see freedom again before you're 60. And if I don't cooperate, then the people I hire to investigate you will be very, very thorough, and what they find will ensure you die in prison. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Elena, that video of you bullying Ji-woo before she killed herself, the one that was supposedly destroyed in the settlement? It's been recovered. Digital forensics are remarkable these days. That video will be released publicly in 72 hours unless you begin cooperation tomorrow. Elena's world tilted. That video doesn't exist. It was destroyed. I watched them delete it. Chun Min-jae smiled then, and it was the most frightening expression Elena had ever seen. Nothing is ever truly destroyed, Elena. Not when someone with resources decides to find it. You built your life on making people believe comfortable lies. Now you get to learn what happens when someone forces you to face uncomfortable truths. He left. The man in the black suit appeared, gesturing for Elena to follow. She was escorted out the same way she'd entered, through the unmarked door into the alley. Make sure you subscribe because what happens when someone accepts Chun Min-jae's offer will show you exactly how justice can work when power decides to serve it rather than obstruct it. Elena stood in that alley for 20 minutes after they left her, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than fear. She'd built her entire life on the belief that she was smarter than everyone else, that she could manipulate systems, exploit weaknesses, and stay 3 steps ahead of consequences. She destroyed people and walked away clean because she understood how to use wealth and connections as shields. But she'd never encountered someone like Chun Min-jae, someone who operated on a level where wealth and connections were merely tools, not protections. Someone who could orchestrate her destruction without ever breaking a single law himself, simply by ensuring that existing laws were enforced with prejudice. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, different from the one that had summoned her here. Prosecutor's office. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Come prepared to make a full statement. This is your only chance. Elena looked up at the Seoul skyline, at the glittering lights that had once represented everything she'd clawed her way toward. She thought about Ji-woo's mother, about the Singapore woman who'd lost her savings, about all the people she'd destroyed in her climb toward wealth that was never really hers. And she thought about Chica, standing in that ballroom with champagne dripping from her dress, protecting her baby with one hand while the world watched her humiliation. Elena had asked herself earlier how she was supposed to know who Chica really was. But she was asking the wrong question. The right question, the one that would haunt her through every day of her prison sentence, was simpler. How did she become someone who thought humiliating a pregnant woman was acceptable regardless of who that woman was married to? 3 weeks after the Gala incident, Chica went into labor. It wasn't the peaceful, planned hospital birth she'd imagined. It was 3 a.m., 2 weeks early, and the contractions came fast enough that Chun Min-jae drove her to the hospital himself, breaking every traffic law between their penthouse and Seoul's most exclusive medical center. She delivered their daughter at 7:23 a.m., a healthy 7-pound baby with her mother's eyes and her father's determined expression. They named her Min-hee, which meant brightness and beauty, and when the nurse placed her in Chica's arms for the first time, the champagne incident felt like something that had happened to a different person in a different lifetime. But the world hadn't forgotten. The waiting room outside Chica's private suite was filled with flowers from people she'd never met. Strangers who'd watched the video and felt compelled to send blessings to the pregnant woman who'd been humiliated simply for existing in a space that should have been safe. There were flowers from Ji-woo's parents, with a card that read simply, "Thank you for bringing light to darkness. May your daughter never know the cruelty ours endured." There were flowers from the Singapore woman, from the Tokyo businessman, from every victim Elena had destroyed over the years. They were thanking Chica for something she hadn't asked for, something she'd never intended. Her humiliation had become the catalyst that finally brought their tormentor to justice. Chun Min-jae sat beside her hospital bed, holding his daughter with a kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Chica watched him, this man whose reputation was built on fear and violence, cradling new life with hands that trembled slightly. What happened to her? Chica asked quietly. She hadn't wanted to know, had tried to move forward without looking back. But now, with her daughter sleeping peacefully, she needed to understand what justice looked like in her husband's world. Chun Min-jae didn't pretend not to know who she meant. Elena Park is cooperating fully with prosecutors. She's confessed to 15 separate fraud schemes and provided testimony that's leading to arrests of accomplices across 3 countries. She's also admitted on record to bullying Ji-woo Park and expressed remorse for her actions. Do you believe the remorse is real? He considered this. I believe she regrets getting caught. Whether she regrets the harm she caused is less certain. But the legal system doesn't require genuine remorse, only cooperation. She'll serve 8 to 10 years if she continues to provide useful testimony. Chica nodded slowly. It felt inadequate, 8 to 10 years for a decade of destroyed lives. But it was more than Elena would have faced if not for the viral video, the public outrage, and the resources Chun had applied to ensure justice worked as intended. Did you threaten her? Chica asked. I offered her a choice. Cooperation or thorough investigation. She chose cooperation. He looked at his wife directly. I didn't hurt her, Chica. I didn't need to. The evidence of her crimes was already there. I simply ensured it reached the right people. And the video of Ji-woo? The one that was supposedly destroyed. A slight smile crossed his face. Digital forensics can be remarkably effective when properly funded. The video was recovered from an old phone that had been sold years ago. Completely legal recovery. The threat to release it publicly convinced Elena that protecting her image was less important than protecting her freedom. Chica understood then. Her husband hadn't manufactured evidence or broken laws. He'd simply applied resources and pressure to ensure that existing crimes were properly investigated and that a system designed to protect the wealthy functioned, for once, exactly as it should. It was justice, but it was justice that required someone with power to make it happen. And that reality bothered her more than she wanted to admit. What about the gala? She asked. Did anyone else face consequences? The head of security was terminated. The event coordinator who approved the guest list is under review. The organization issued a public apology and announced new protocols for handling discrimination incidents. Chun paused. And they've invited you to serve on their diversity oversight committee. Chica laughed at that, a sound that made Min-hee stir slightly in her father's arms. They want the woman they allowed to be humiliated to help them prevent future humiliations. The irony is remarkable. You don't have to accept. I know. She looked at her daughter, at this new life that would grow up in a world still learning how to make space for people who didn't fit narrow definitions of belonging. But maybe I should. Maybe that's how change actually happens. Not through one person's punishment, but through systematic shifts that make cruelty harder to commit and easier to address. She'd been thinking about this a lot in the past 3 weeks. The video had sparked important conversations about racism in Seoul's elite spaces, about how pregnancy should be protected regardless of the pregnant person's background, about the way wealth and status had historically shielded people like Elena from consequences. But conversations without action were just noise. Chica was a lawyer. She understood that real change required institutional shifts, policy changes, and people willing to do the unglamorous work of committee meetings and protocol reviews. "I'll accept the position," she said, "but on my terms. I want real authority to implement changes, not just symbolic representation." Chun smiled, pride evident in his expression. "I would expect nothing less from you." A nurse appeared at the door, politely informing them that visiting hours would begin soon and that several people had requested to see them. News outlets wanting statements. Well-wishers seeking blessings. People who wanted to witness the happy ending to a story that had captivated millions. Chica shook her head. "No visitors today. Today is just for us." The nurse nodded and disappeared. Chun stood, carrying Min-hee to Chica so she could nurse. As their daughter latched on, Chica felt the strange duality of her life settling into place. She was a mother now. She was also the wife of one of Korea's most feared men. She was a victim of racism who'd become an accidental symbol of resistance. She was a human rights lawyer who'd left her career for love, but was finding new ways to pursue justice. None of these identities contradicted each other. They simply existed simultaneously, making her story more complex than any single narrative could capture. Subscribe to this channel because the final chapter reveals what happens 1 year later, when the lessons of this story have rippled far beyond a single viral moment. Outside the hospital, Seoul continued its relentless rhythm. News cycles moved to new outrages. Social media found new villains to destroy. The champagne incident became a case study in university classes about viral justice, a reference point in discussions about racism and accountability. But for Chica, Chun, and their daughter, life narrowed to something simpler. Midnight feedings. First smiles. The everyday miracles of new parenthood that made everything else feel distant and somehow less important. Elena Park would serve her sentence. Ji-woo's family would finally have some measure of justice. The systems that had allowed cruelty to flourish would implement reforms that might possibly make the next victim's path to justice slightly less difficult. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the fairy tale ending that viral stories sometimes promise. But it was real, and complicated, and human. And sometimes, Chica thought as she watched her husband sing softly to their daughter in Korean and English and Igbo, sometimes that's more valuable than any perfect ending could ever be. The Grand Josian ballroom looked exactly as Chica remembered it. Crystal chandeliers dripping golden light. Marble floors reflecting the movements of Korea's elite. The same orchestra playing the same elegant music. But everything was different. Chica stood near the center of the room this time, not hiding by the walls. Min-hee was at home with a nanny, sleeping peacefully, 13 months old and already showing signs of inheriting both her mother's quiet strength and her father's stubborn determination. Chun Min-jae stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. They were attending the annual Met Gala again, but this time Chica was here as the keynote speaker for the event's new diversity initiative. The organization had changed more than Chica had expected. Real changes, not just performative ones. The guest list review process now included diversity consultants. Security had been trained in recognizing and addressing discrimination. An incident response protocol had been implemented that prioritized victim support over reputation management. Were these changes perfect? No. Did they solve systemic racism? Absolutely not. But they were steps, and Chica had learned through her legal career that progress happened through accumulation of small steps, not through waiting for one giant leap. Nervous? Chun asked quietly. Terrified, Chica admitted. Public speaking has never been my strength. You argued cases in front of international courts. That was different. That was about law and evidence. This is personal. The event coordinator appeared, the same Kim Sang-woo who'd rushed to her aid the previous year. Mrs. Chun, we're ready for your speech whenever you are. Chika nodded, taking a deep breath. She walked to the podium positioned at the front of the ballroom, feeling hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. Some were curious. Some were supportive. And some, she was certain, were resentful that her humiliation had forced them to examine their own biases and behaviors. She didn't have notes. She'd tried writing a formal speech, but it had felt wrong, too stiff and corporate. Instead, she spoke from the heart about what she'd learned in the year since champagne had ruined her ivory gown. A year ago, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. I stood in this room feeling like I didn't belong. I was the only black woman here, visibly pregnant, and I could feel the weight of judgment from every direction. The room had gone quiet. People who'd been there that night shifted uncomfortably. What happened next has been documented, analyzed, and discussed extensively. A woman poured champagne on me and shouted racist words. The video went viral. Justice, of a sort, was served. Chika paused, making eye contact with people throughout the ballroom. But I'm not here to talk about that incident. I'm here to talk about what comes after. Because viral moments fade. Public outrage moves to the next crisis. And if we're not careful, all the promises we make in the heat of that outrage fade too. She detailed the changes the organization had implemented, acknowledging both their significance and their limitations. She talked about the ongoing work needed to create spaces where everyone could feel safe and welcome, not just those who fit traditional definitions of belonging. True change doesn't happen through punishment alone, Chika said. It happens through sustained commitment to uncomfortable conversations, to policy changes that cost resources and time, and to holding ourselves accountable even when cameras aren't watching. She could see some people nodding, engaged with her message. Others looked skeptical. A few seemed actively hostile to the suggestion that their world needed changing. That was fine. Chika wasn't trying to convince everyone. She was speaking to the people who were ready to listen, who understood that spaces like this had been built to exclude, and that exclusion had to be actively dismantled, not just politely ignored. She concluded her speech with words that had come to her while nursing Min-hee that morning. My daughter will grow up in a world that still has work to do. She'll face people who see her skin color before they see her humanity. She'll enter spaces where she's not expected to belong. But I hope that when she does, those spaces will be a little bit better than they were for me. Not because of one viral video, but because enough people decided that making others feel welcome was more important than protecting comfort. The applause was mixed. Enthusiastic from some. Polite from others. Absent from a few. Chika didn't expect anything different. Real change was always met with resistance. She returned to Chun's side, and he squeezed her hand gently. Well done. Was it enough? Words alone are never enough, but they're a necessary start. Throughout the evening, people approached Chika. Some thanked her for her speech. Others shared their own experiences of feeling excluded in elite spaces. A few offered genuine apologies for not speaking up the previous year when they'd witnessed her humiliation. One woman, elderly and elegant, pulled Chika aside with an urgency that suggested importance. I was here that night, the woman said. I saw what Elena did, and I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't want to make a scene. I've regretted that silence every day since. Chika listened, seeing genuine remorse in the woman's eyes. My granddaughter is biracial, the woman continued. Korean and British. She's 7 years old, and she's already being asked to explain why she looks different. I think about her facing what you faced, and I wonder if there will be someone who speaks up for her, since I failed to speak up for you. You're speaking up now, Chica said gently. That matters too. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. For your grace. You didn't have to accept this position, didn't have to come back here. You could have walked away from all of us. Chica thought about that. She could have walked away. Could have retreated into the safety of her penthouse and her family, let the viral moment define her as victim rather than advocate. But she was a lawyer. She'd spent her entire career believing that systems could be changed, that justice was worth pursuing even when difficult. Walking away would have meant abandoning those beliefs. I didn't come back for the people who hurt me, Chica said. I came back for the next person who walks into a room feeling like they don't belong. So they have slightly better protocols, slightly more training, slightly higher chances that someone will speak up. The evening progressed. Chica made connections, exchanged contact information with other diversity advocates, and planted seeds for future collaborations. It was unglamorous work, the kind that would never go viral, but it was the work that actually mattered. As the gala wound down, Chun and Chica left together, walking through the same doors she'd entered alone the previous year. Outside, Seoul's night air was crisp and clean. Do you think it made a difference? Chica asked as their driver pulled up. Tonight? Probably minimal. But sustained effort over time? Yes. Definitely. Chun helped her into the car, then slid in beside her. You're planting trees whose shade you may never sit under. That's the hardest kind of work. Chica leaned against her husband, exhausted but satisfied. I keep thinking about Elena. About how she's serving her sentence while I'm here giving speeches. Is that justice? Is it enough? Justice is rarely simple, Chun said. She's paying legal consequences for her crimes. You're using your pain to create change. Both things are true simultaneously. The car drove through Seoul's glittering streets. Chica watched the city pass, thinking about all the stories hidden behind those glowing windows. People struggling with discrimination. People learning to be better. People making mistakes and facing consequences. Her phone buzzed. A message from the nanny with a photo of Minhee sleeping, her small fist curled near her face. That's what mattered most. Not the speeches or the viral moments or the justice served. But this small person who would inherit whatever world they built through their choices and commitments. Let's go home, Chica said. Our daughter will be awake soon, and I want to be there when she opens her eyes. Chun nodded to the driver, who adjusted their route. As they drove toward home, toward their daughter, toward the ordinary miracle of a family finding its rhythm, Chica felt something settle inside her. The champagne incident would always be part of her story, but it wouldn't define her story. She was more than a victim. She was a mother, a lawyer, an advocate, a woman learning to navigate power while maintaining her humanity. And maybe, she thought as they pulled into their building's secure garage, maybe that's what justice really looks like. Not perfect endings or complete resolutions, but people choosing every day to do slightly better, to speak up slightly louder, to make the world slightly more welcoming for whoever comes next. If this story moved you, if it made you think about how power operates and how change happens, please subscribe to this channel. Because stories like this matter, not because they're dramatic, but because they're real. The car stopped. Chun helped Chica out, his hand steady and sure. Together, they rode the elevator up to their penthouse, where their daughter waited, where their life continued, where the next chapter was already beginning. And in that moment, with all its complexity and imperfection and stubborn hope, Chica Rowland felt something she hadn't felt in that ballroom a year ago. She felt like she belonged. Not because space had been made for her, but because she'd claimed her space and refused to be driven from it. That, she understood now, was its own kind of power. The kind that couldn't be poured away with champagne or shouted down with racist words. The kind that grew stronger every time it was challenged and survived. The kind that would, she hoped, shelter her daughter through whatever storms lay ahead. This story teaches us something crucial about human nature and the systems we build. Power isn't always loud. Justice doesn't always look like revenge. And change happens not through single dramatic moments, but through sustained commitment to uncomfortable work. Elena Park's downfall wasn't just about one woman's cruelty being punished. It was about a pattern of harm that had been allowed to continue for years because systems protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Her viral humiliation simply made visible what had always been there. Chica's story shows us that victims don't owe the world their trauma transformed into activism. She could have walked away. But she chose to stay, to use her pain as fuel for systemic change, because she understood something that Elena never could. Real power isn't the ability to humiliate others without consequences. Real power is the choice to build systems that protect everyone, especially those who can't protect themselves. The lesson isn't that viral videos bring justice. It's that justice requires both immediate accountability and long-term commitment. The champagne incident brought Elena to court, but it was Chica's sustained advocacy that began changing the conditions that allowed someone like Elena to flourish in the first place. We live in a world that loves simple narratives. Villain punished, victim vindicated, everyone moves on. But real life is messier. Real change requires us to sit with discomfort, to examine our own biases, to speak up even when it's easier to stay silent. The woman who apologized to Chica a year later, who admitted she'd witnessed cruelty and done nothing, she's all of us. We all face moments when we can choose comfort or courage. The story doesn't end with making the right choice. It continues with what we do after we've made the wrong one. That's the uncomfortable truth this story offers. We're not divided into villains and heroes. We're all people making choices, facing consequences, and deciding whether we'll learn from our mistakes or repeat them. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is choose to make the next person's path slightly less difficult than our own was. Not because it's dramatic or will go viral, but simply because it's right. That's how the world changes. One choice, one conversation, one uncomfortable commitment at a time.